This video is sponsored by 80,000 Hours. In 2008, Luciano Garibaldi created Medusa with the head of Perseus. It depicts a nude Medusa holding the severed head of the hero Perseus. It was an inversion of the Cellini sculpture Perseus with the head of Medusa. In the story of Perseus, he is the son of Zeus and Danae, he is the golden shower baby, and he is also the half-brother and great-grandfather of Hercules, because that's just Greek mythology for you. Perseus is sent to kill Medusa by the guy that wants to marry his mom, and he, with the help of multiple gods, cuts the head of Medusa off as she is sleeping. Garibaldi's inversion began to blow up in social media during the Me Too period of 2018, mainly because in the myths, Medusa is transformed into a monster by the goddess Athena after the former is assaulted by the god Poseidon. Garibaldi said of this work, quote, "There are lots of depictions of Medusa, and they are always describing the myth at its worst. What would it look like? Her victory, not his. How should that sculpture look?" Now, there are some issues with the framing of the statue as a Me Too moment. It's created by a man who didn't do it with feminism in mind. Medusa wasn't raped by Perseus, etc. But what I think is meaningful about the excitement around the statue and the reclaiming of Medusa in art is how it illustrates the way we keep reimagining and asking what if about these stories and these narratives, especially as we grow into a better understanding of the holes that exist within the classics. If you walk into a bookstore and look at new releases, you are likely going to see at least 1 to 2 feminist retellings of Greek mythological figures. I have quite a few of them, and I have more of them on Audible and on Kindle. We are seeing this new boom of retellings of Greek mythology. We have some from Norse mythology as well, and classics like Beowulf and African folklore. All of that is happening, but more than others, you can definitely see a leaning towards the Greek. But it's not new. People have been retelling Greek stories forever. I mean, it's all kind of fan fiction based on cults that people think they understand, but they really don't. But I think what's interesting is asking, what does this new generation of reimagined classics say about the moment and the limitations of these imaginations versus fundamentally changing the way we learn these stories in an academic setting? I think when we discuss Greek mythology, it's worth asking, how did you get into Greek mythology? For me, it was a combination of Xena, the Hercules Disney movie.
Fabulous party. You know, I haven't seen this much love in a room since Narcissus discovered himself.
And just the colorful books that I would see that would say Greek mythology, but for kids. All really inaccurate depictions of just about everything. There are also a whole slew of children-based Greek mythology stories that are just PG-13 versions of the story. And I'm not talking about Percy Jackson, because Percy Jackson and the Olympians is lit. I'm talking about the bright colored ones that you will see that you're allowed to give to children. And by the time that you truly understand that Apollo, Zeus, Poseidon, etc. are all serial predators, you've probably watched more media that has turned them into the good guys. The main reason that people think that Hades is evil is because most media makes him that way, even though it's not necessarily that in the different source materials that we do have.
The interesting contrast with Hades, the character, the idea, whatever, is how much changes from iteration to iteration while at the same time still being borrowed. That Satan-y undertone that keeps popping up, for instance, despite the fact that it's never really there in the mythology.
We've already flooded these texts with modernity, but just in a way that we have been told is the norm. We have never, in the Western culture that we live in now, seen the Greco-Roman society separate from the Catholicism that create a new boom of their art unless you study the classics directly. When it comes to women in Greek mythology, the shortcuts made in art and the lack of major motion pictures that try to focus on major female characters means that when we see certain female figures or goddesses, we see them distilled through years of art that was made after centuries of separation between the texts, and those texts being simply what we have remaining from these cultures and societies that were created and recreated and reshared and spoken, which we have to remember is a choice because there are major stories in the Greek mythological canon that center women, center complex women. And despite the sexism of ancient Greece, there are many nuances that we have lost by how we teach and recreate these works. You know, you really don't get to explore Medea outside of like a few stories. Things like the Trojan women has only been adapted into cinema once. And while you can see them in plays, that is not often as accessible as it would be if you were to see like a big budget reimagining of that. I mean, remember that year we had two Hercules movies?
Who are you? I am Hercules! I give you Hercules!
Both called Hercules. The very adjective is Heracles. Heracles. His name is Shade. That's important to understand. And they keep cutting it out because it's clunky to say, but it's important. His name is Glory to Hera, and that's why she hates him so much, on top of everything. Anyway, so look back. Part of it starts from the issue of what we call Greek mythology. Now, full disclaimer, I am not a classicist, and even though I have a master's in English with a focus on theory, I don't know everything. What I don't know, I look it up, and I have sources, and I will list some of them down below for this video, but I am mostly distilling a bunch of information that I have from books that I've read and the studies and journals that I've done before. So to sum it up, our concept of ancient Greece is filtered through a concept of whiteness that is more unifying than what would have existed then. To the ancient Greeks, to be a barbarian was to be anything else besides Greek, including other white people. In stories, we will see the Greeks interact with other societies. Medea is from what would be present-day Georgia. Troy is in Turkey. Helen spends part of the Trojan War in some version of the text in Egypt. So when we're talking about the scope of Greek mythology, we're talking about works that include the countries that border the Mediterranean Sea, from North Africa, what we would call the Middle East, or back then the ancient Near East, to Eastern Europe and like Slovenia. Even the Amazon warriors that we tie so closely with Greek mythology and Greek culture are not actually from Greece. They are foreigners. They are barbarians. That's why they're always fighting the Greeks. Part of why I like the show Troy, Fall of a City is because it takes the time to at least show that the Trojans are culturally different from the Greeks stylistically. So it doesn't look like two armies of the same kind of white person just clashing up against each other all the time. And all the reason why we see these nations and these societies through the lens of Greek mythology is because, first of all, we're hearing these stories being told from the Greek sources of the text predominantly, and the Romans, shout out to Virgil, and also because Western Europeans at the Renaissance saw themselves as the descendants of the Greeks, and therefore it makes sense that they would then take this culture that is in many ways fundamentally different than their own and transpose their own concepts of race and gender and politics and borders onto them. Therefore, now all these characters are more universal than they would be othered, and that gender politics shows in the art. I mean, do you ever think about how if you look at like the remains of like Grecian art of the Judgment of Paris, that all the goddesses are clothed, but in most of the Renaissance pictures, they're mostly naked, and it's like, why would Athena and Hera be showing puss on the main? Speaking of puss.
Boom shakalaka laka, boom shakalaka laka.
Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves, Women in Classical Antiquity by Sarah B. Pomeroy was probably the first academic text I read about this subject, and it's one of the classics lol in history and women's studies. It was first published in 1975, and it discusses the role of women during the period that we would call antiquity. It was one of the first works on women's history in any period to be published in English, which sounds wild to say out loud, but here we are. It's romantic lunch. I didn't even eat breakfast. In the text, she talks not just about the roles of goddesses in Greek culture and what they signify, but also the average lives of women in Sparta, Rome, Athens, and girl, it is bleak. For example, let us read this piece of advice from Hesiod, ancient Greek poet, probably mispronouncing his name, but I don't respect him because he don't respect me. And he is, funny enough, one of the major sources on what we call Greek mythology. And he says, "Do not let a woman with a sexy rump deceive you with wheeling and coaxing words. She's after your barn. The man who trusts a woman trusts deceivers. Bring home a wife when you are of the right age, not much under 30, not much more. This is the right age for marriage. Let your wife have been grown up 4 years. Marry her in the 5th. This means 15. Marry a maiden so you can teach her careful ways, and especially marry one who lives near you. But examine everything around and see that your marriage will not be a joke to your neighbors. For a man wins nothing better than a good wife, and again, nothing worse than a bad one. There's another poet who I think put this concept even more succinctly.
Never trust a big button smile, that girl is poison.
So yeah, being a woman in antiquity in Greece was not great to decent to pretty good, depending on what your status was, what city-state you were in, because we have to remember each city-state was doing their own thing. So like if you were in Sparta, as some of you might remember from 300, is that they did give their women slightly more mobility. They honored women who died in childbirth and wanted their women to be strong and well taken care of so they could have more sons. So they wanted women to exercise. They like had more training. They were meant to be physically fit. They were outdoorsy, you know, not like other girls of Greece. Athens, however, most women in classical Athens were not educated in anything of like any serious merit and served 2 functions as wives: to have children and to run the household. And if you were a rich woman, then the wifely ideal for you is that you would marry an older man, give him children, make sure the household ran properly, and never go outside except to do cult stuff. There are benefits to that, I can imagine. But of course, this could only really happen if you were wealthy. If you were just a regular broad, then you'd have to, get water from the well, help your husband. You'd have to work if you were lower class.
According to my ma, we're actually quite poor. Hi, I think we might be as well.
They had very few rights in Athens. There's some discussion about if they even had citizenship, which, fun. They weren't part of the political process, although they were allowed to watch debates, but not participate. But you as a woman could get a divorce from your husband if another man or your father spoke up for you. So even in that case, it's not Steven Crowder's perfect society. So we start from this ground level of a society that is very sexist, doesn't view women very highly, and doesn't even really put women on a romantic sexual pedestal. They're meant to be breeders and be invisible. Yet, at the same time, we have Athens literally being named after a female goddess of war and wisdom. But then Athena never literally met a woman that she would defend. So if men no longer have stands, that means Athena is dead. And this was one of the interesting contradictions of the way that the Greeks would view their goddesses as these shining, divine, spectacular beings, but they were like, regular women ain't shit. And because they weren't allowed to have a public life, we don't have that many remaining public texts about what women's lives were in ancient Greece from their perspective. And so you have a society where these Greek gods come from cults that used to be tribal cults that have now been conglomerated, that are maintained by women in one sphere, but then there are no living tales told by women that we have. We now see that women in Greek mythology, even the best written ones, come from a cultural foundation of the ideal woman being silent, being passive, standing by their men. And when that doesn't happen, trouble come.
All day, every day, therapist, mother maid, nymph, then a virgin.
And not only Haynes' Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths, she discusses how the female characters in many of these stories have been portrayed in reductive ways, but also how it doesn't always track with the classic texts themselves, because even a sexist culture can create fascinating female characters. A lot of this can be seen foundationally in the titular figure of Pandora. Her origin you probably might know, but for the sake of those who don't, let's set the scene. I feel like a lavender mint is a good candle choice for this. Way back when, Hephaestus stole fire from the gods to give to men, and Zeus is pissed. He's like, who the fuck is this guy giving mankind stuff for free? Doesn't even make them join an MLM. Doesn't track. I don't like it. So he decides that he is gonna send man a kalon kakon, a beautiful evil, which I will get that tattooed on me because that is fire. That evil is woman. For from her is the race of woman and female kind. Of her is the deadly race and tribe of women who live amongst mortal men to their great trouble. No helpmeets in hateful poverty, but only in wealth. So essentially, Pandora is mother. We should know that the person whose text is being cited as one of the earliest written versions of this story is the guy who told men to look out for sexy romps. So the agenda is set. Pandora is given all of the gifts from the gods. She's fine, she's smart, she gowned up, she could spit on the loom, which for the ancient Athenians was hot girl shit. If your loom game was solid, bitch. All the ills, as we know them, are put into what is called a pithos, which is a storage jar, but gets translated into a box because now Prometheus told his brother, whose name I can't pronounce, don't take anything from Zeus. But when Zeus presents, he sends Hermes. So I guess he thought that was a loop around. So Hermes brings Pandora to, I'm going to try and pronounce it, Epimetheus? We're going to go with that. So he gives Pandora to Epimetheus, and Epimetheus is like, I will take this woman. So he takes Pandora, who then scatters the jar of all the ills. Hope remains to, exist and, I don't know, be used by a really smart witch to, make a cure for lycanthropy with her hot boyfriend eventually. Whatever. So from the moment that the undivine woman appears in text, in Greek mythology, as we know it, she is a blight. She exists to create strife, to be curious beyond her own good, and to be so attractive that it brings disaster upon her, her family, and everyone in her life. Beware a sexy rump. And it's no wonder that this image of her is a silly woman who opens a box remains, because the sexism comes from this story being superimposed upon the other hot girl who gets in trouble for everything, Eve. Eve, it's the apple, even though it was all hashtag God's plan, but now we have to have cramps and painful pregnancies if we're cis women so that we can't get up after birth like a gazelle because in biblical times some bent ate a fruit. It's always this mentality of men were doing fine and then women coming in with their jars and their apple snakes and their curiosities to ruin a good fucking time. So at the root of our classics, the bedrock of our great Western whatever the fuck, are concepts that women are inherently the problem. And throughout text, we have ones that limit women, limit their possibilities, and mostly stigmatize them. But thankfully, we do have one verifiable champion to the badass bitches of Greek myth lore, Euripides. If there is one man you can trust to do women right in a tragedy, the Hosea of the ancient world, my man Euripides.
Let me be your hero.
Euripides is one of the 3 Greek tragic playwrights who we still have surviving plays of, along with Aeschylus and Sophocles. Of Euripides' works, he's written 2 of my favorites, Medea and The Trojan Woman. Medea, as some of you know, is the inspiration for this part of my tattoo. In Medea, the titular sorceress of divine heritage has just found out that her ancient husband, Jason, is going to marry some other princess and send her into exile with her children. And as a result, she kills everybody except Jason, because she dooms him to wander the earth as a shell of his former self, having murdered, his new girlfriend, the girlfriend father, and her 2 children, which is what makes that play so controversial. So, background. Back in the day, when people were doing their tragedies, it'd be a contest, and they'd be out there competing to see who could tell the best story. Now, this one got second place, which it just teaches you that not all greatness is recognized in its time. Medea, for all intents and purposes, despite being kind of the archetypal evil wife and mother in this text, by killing her children, is framed as the hero. And that makes sense in the context of the story, because even though, as we know, Euripides is writing this play, one, to have commentary about the fact that, like, foreign wives in Athens didn't have many rights. So he was, first of all, being like, that sounds like bullshit. Euripides was woke agenda. He also frames Jason in this story as being an oath breaker because, one, his patron was Hera, goddess of marriage, betraying his marriage. Girl, the force was not strong with him. The other kicker is that Jason watched Medea kill her own brother, chop him up for him, and he swore to all the gods that he would be with her and love her until he dead. And then he didn't.
I mean, I'm like, you kill one man, you kill a dozen. It's all the same. I mean, they can only hang you once, right? Like, am I right? Am I right?
And for a society that is so built upon revenge killing of family members, the fact that Medea is giving the first deus ex machina in order to get away with murder of her own children sets her up as the hero, the villain protagonist. She is written to be sympathetic, to be thought of as someone put into a difficult situation, even though she kills her own children. And fun fact, Euripides is considered to be the first person to actively make Medea responsible for killing her sons. In older versions, apparently, they are killed by other people. So he literally makes her more villainous in order to illustrate the double standards and the places in society that she, as a foreign woman, as a wife, has been scorned. That despite doing everything right, killing everybody for her man, having 2 sons, being loyal and faithful, her husband betrays her, and so he has to be the one to suffer. And that is what we call supporting women's wrongs. The other great play that I think is really emblematic of what he brings to the Greek mythology is the Trojan Women, which was written during the time of the Peloponnesian War and is now seen as to be an anti-war text. It focuses on Hecuba, who is the former queen of Troy, Cassandra, one of the daughters of Hecuba, Andromache, who is the wife of Hector, and Helen, aka Helen of Troy / Sparta, in the aftermath of the war. Hecuba is going to be sold as a slave to Odysseus. Cassandra is going to go with King Agamemnon to be a concubine, where she will be murdered by Clytemnestra. Princess Andromache has to watch her only son be thrown from the walls of Troy to ensure that Hector's bloodline doesn't seek revenge against the literal genocide that's being played out against the family.
That's why you're always in the what?
The bloodline.
The motherfucking bloodline, yes!
And finally, Helen has to use all of her brilliance and divine charm in order to not be killed by her husband, who has just returned. And it is a text that elevates all of these female characters who, in the Iliad, and also in our larger way that we view the story of the Trojan War, don't get as much to do as they could for people who are very impactful to the story. It is bleak, but it's also honest about the way in which war impacts women. Cassandra has a voice for the first time, really, because of it. Helen is allowed to defend herself because of it. Andromache is allowed to have really true grief because of it, along with Hecuba. And it also illustrates the fact that, like, women, for whatever place they held in society, whether they be princess, whether they be priestess, whether they be slave girl, they all could suffer at the brutality of men. I mean, the Greeks literally sacrificed one of the princesses of Troy so that she can be a funeral bride for Achilles. And if Euripides could do that then to an audience that was antagonistic towards women, inherently saw them as, again, beautiful evil, then it shows that there are already existing threads which modern writers have now taken and spun into their own narratives.
I know it hurts.
Modern feminist retellings of Greek myths are not new, especially in romance or anywhere else. So some of them, for example, I have our Stone Blind, which is a reimagining of Medusa told from multiple different perspectives. The story of Phaedra is so fucked up because here's what happens. So Medusa, we know. So Phaedra, she's the younger sister of Ariadne, married to Theseus, who literally is one of the worst men in all of Greek mythology, up there with Zeus, honestly. He kidnapped Helen when she was 8 years old, when he was in his old-ass, dusty-ass age, and in some versions, she had a son with him before she was sent back at 10, which is impossible, but that's what they said. He, of course, leaves Ariadne on the beach. He kidnaps an Amazon. Phaedra is his last wife, I think. And essentially, he has a son. His name is Hippolytus. And Hippolytus is a boy sworn to Artemis, but talks shit about Aphrodite. And Aphrodite, when you talk shit about Aphrodite, you put your life into your own hands. And so essentially, she curses Phaedra with painful lust of Hippolytus, which accumulates in one of the nurses finding out, Hippolytus being told by said nurse, Phaedra deciding to, for the sake of YouTube and future editing me, unalives herself because of it, but then accuses Hippolytus of assault in the process. And it is deeply tragic because, again, the gods do not care who gets punished, who is hurt in the process. They just want to destroy people. Daughters of Sparta, which talks about Helen and Clytemnestra, who are sisters, and which is often ignored. There's also a book about Clytemnestra that just got released, another text about Atalanta, who is the only woman to be an Argonaut, which was these groups that went out with Jason to go find the Golden Fleece. And I think while it's easy to dismiss this trend as just like wokeness or just feminist, whatever, I think it's important to realize that this is building upon a thread that Euripides did himself. These texts are ever evolving. We don't know that much about the ancient Greeks. We don't know much about the Dark Ages and all these periods because we don't have all the information. But we do see a desire to take threads of these women's lives and bring them forth into a new level of imagination. And I think that's what we see women authors trying to do, because this is the first time that we are seeing legions of texts come out from female voices about these female characters, because it just wasn't happening before. And yes, we have things like the Penelope, but I think right now we are in a new age where this is possible on not just a youth level, because for a long time there have always been, younger YA retellings. I think Percy Jackson and the Olympians definitely deserves so much credit, in my opinion, for not just making a really great series that is constantly evolving. Uncle Rick is constantly putting his foot in it of like really listening to the audience in constructive ways and evolving the text to be more inclusive and more thoughtful. And I love that for them, while also, telling these really complicated stories without whitewashing them. Then you have stuff like Lore Olympus, which I've talked about in my Persephone video, which really focus on what a millennial age group is looking for in terms of having these new, softer versions of the stories that touch on the older aspects of it, but modernize it in a way that is really for a different sort of audience. But when it comes to literary fiction, other than the Penelope, there haven't been that many that we can really see. And that's why I think Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles is the game changer ultimately in what we are seeing right now. Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles made this possible because it allowed literary fiction to embrace reimaginings of the Greek myths in a serious way. And I think Circe, which I love even more personally, is my hot take, I love it even more than The Song of Achilles, solidified that you can take these stories and keep building upon them into something deeper. And The Song of Achilles is so popular that it has really changed the way that we view these characters. Like, now people expect queerness from Achilles in a way they never did before. And I think that's what's so great, is that when we give people who haven't had the opportunity to think they have room to have access in these places, that they can create really amazing stories.
I am the one and only
Electra.
80,000 Hours is a nonprofit that over the last 10 or so years has been researching the question of how to find a fulfilling career that happens to do good as well, something that has gotten increasingly important for everyone. In the wake of the Great Resignation, which began around early 2021 due to COVID-19, people left their jobs due to a number of issues: low pay, no opportunities for advancement, and a general feeling of being disrespected at work. It speaks to not just a desire to find better work, but more fulfilling work. With 80,000 Hours, when it comes to helping you find a career, everything they publish is based on careful consideration of data and consultation with experts, and taking into account the best evidence they could find on each topic. They are able to make serious recommendations on questions like, where should I work if I actually want to make a positive difference in the world? What are the most pressing problems facing humanity today, and how might we solve them? What can I do today to start planning a fulfilling career? You can join their free newsletter, and they'll send you an in-depth guide that helps you learn about what makes for a high-impact career, great new ideas for impactful paths, and make new plans based on what you've learned and put them into action. 80,000 Hours also hosts a job board with nearly 1,000 currently open high-impact career opportunities. And if you already have some ideas about what career you're seeking out, they offer free one-on-one advice to help you switch paths from one career to another. If you join the newsletter now, you will get a free copy of their in-depth career guide sent to your inbox. Just sign up at the link below. And just to be completely clear and transparent, they are a nonprofit, and everything they provide is free. If you sign up using my custom link down below, you'll be able to get started planning this career that really works for you, get some good advice, and just see what else is out there. There's literally nothing to lose.
2 words. I am retired.
In 2017, Emily Wilson became the first woman to publish a translation of Homer's Odyssey into English, which I own. While that title is something that she feels awkward about, it still highlights the fact that despite women being involved in commentary of the classics since forever, there are still boundaries that exist and need to be broken in terms of who gets the ability to shape the way we view the classics, the way we view canon. There are a number of published translations by women into other languages, and of course there are plenty of other female Homerists in the United Kingdom and the United States and beyond. I worried that some of the covers seem to obscure or erase the work of other women by presenting me as unique in ways that I am not. I want all possible credit to be given to other female classicists and other female translators, as well as other Homerists of all genders, from many of whom I've learned a huge amount and with whom I'm in constant conversation. We've been seeing these changes happen with discussions on ancient statues and the pushback against the way we discuss whiteness, and examinations of gender is part of that process. It also needs to be okay to think about your own gender identity and racial identity while working in the classics. Literally, men transpose their ideas onto the Greeks all the time, even while actual Greek people exist. Notice how a jar became a box because it was more accessible to those who were translating it. Yet if you're a woman or a person of color trying to put empathy into a text or playing with different ideas, it's an agenda. I mean, God forbid that you examine the fact that there must have obviously been brown people interacting with the Greeks because of literally where it is in society. But oh no, that's the woke agenda. Yet when the man that we use as the foundation of all of these stories says, beware a sexy rump, and writes about the original woman being a beautiful evil sent to destroy men and all women following her are born evil, that's just literature. I may not love every single one of these new texts that comes out. I feel some of them should be frankly shorter. I think there's a little overlap in too many ways sometimes because of how many we're getting, but their existence means that we have options to ask the questions and get some answers.
The science actually shows that the statues were painted with a variety of skin tones. That's right, but the paint wore off by the time they were unearthed centuries later. So basically, we could have avoided racism if the Greeks just used some primer.
Greek mythology is still full with the untapped potential because of all the things we don't know and are still discovering, of the ways in which classicists are taking things that were very high concept and bringing them down so that the average person can understand them. And that means shaking things up, understanding that race and antiquity is not what we think it is today, understanding that certain concepts like slavery and other things like that are rooted differently in different texts, and how they have evolved shows the way in which the West weaponized things that they really didn't fucking understand. We go from something like Troy, which is the scariest thing you could ever have about the Iliad, to the Song of Achilles, to Hades, which has a significant subplot of getting Achilles and Patroclus back together, and Patroclus is black. And if you've seen my other set, you know I have the art of that on my wall because it's beautiful. We couldn't have that without the evolution we've been seeing. Without the Song of Achilles, you don't have that. And I think that's fucking amazing. I look forward to the way it continues, because if there is any ideas of patriarchy and race that needs to be pushed up against, it's the fucking ancient Greeks and the way in which white culture, TM, has been allowed to take a very fascinating, multicultural, nuanced society with all of its flaws, all of its many, many flaws, and turn it into their fan fiction of masculinity without any sort of introspection is gross.
A lot of groups within the alt-right have looked to antiquity as a way of legitimizing what they're saying and what they're doing. These statues get used as a tool to justify racism.
Sure, the ancient world was full of slavery and oppression, but the fact is the idea of race never played into any of it.
When you have just a monolithic picture of ancient Rome where everybody in your mind looks like a white statue, then that reinforces the idea that these were all just white people walking around in the Roman Empire.
So I say death to that, and most importantly, death to Kronos.
Death to Kronos.